The crown sat heavy on King Salom Drake's head the night he chose to break Elara Voss in front of everyone who had ever known her name. 300 wolves filled the ceremonial hall. Torches burned in iron brackets along the stone walls. The air smelled of pine resin and candle smoke and the particular kind of tension that only gathers in a room where something irreversible is about to happen. The kind of tension that makes people shift in their seats and clear their throats and look at their hands, not because they are bored but because they know, on some animal level, that they are about to witness something they will carry in their memory for a long time. Elara stood at the edge of the hall in a white dress she had made herself. She had spent 4 evenings on it. She had used thread that cost more than she could really afford, the kind with a soft sheen to it that caught the torchlight and held it. She had done that because she believed in this night the way you only believe in something when no one has yet given you a reason not to. She believed the way young people believe before the world teaches them the cost of certainty. She was 22 years old. She had waited for this ceremony for 4 years. She had done everything right. She had been patient. She had been loyal. She had kept her expectations quiet and manageable, and she had never once asked for more than what she had been promised. The hall smelled of old stone and pine. It had been built 2 centuries ago by the Drake line's founders, and the walls remembered every ceremony that had ever been held inside them, absorbed into the mortar the way old buildings absorb sound. Elara had stood at the back of this hall before, twice, watching others stand where she now stood. She had felt something watching them that she could not name exactly, something between longing and patience, the feeling of a person who knows their turn is coming and is content to wait. She was not waiting anymore. The hall filled slowly, deliberately, in the manner of formal park events where the order of arrival communicated rank and intention. Families entered in their proper sequence. Alphas and their households. Elders. Park advisors. The torches were lit in a specific pattern, working outward from the center, and the light built in a way that made the space feel larger than it was and smaller at the same time, the ceiling soaring above them all into darkness and the floor warm with the glow of fire. Elara watched the room fill. She kept her hands loose at her sides. She had practiced this, the keeping of her hands loose, because her natural inclination when she was nervous was to grip things. The hem of a dress. The strap of a bag. The edge of a table. She had trained herself out of it because she did not want to look nervous tonight. She was not interested in showing anyone what was happening inside her chest, which was something between excitement and the particular terror of a dream you have wanted for so long that the moment of its arrival feels unreal. She noticed Lady Seraphine Cole arrive with her household. She noticed the deep blue of her gown and the way she moved through the hall with a confidence that was practiced but not false, the confidence of someone who had been groomed for formal rooms since childhood. She was beautiful. Elara registered this without particular emotion. Beauty was not the competition. She was not in competition with anyone. She was fated. That meant something. She believed that then. The hall went quiet when King Salom Drake rose from his seat at the head of the room. He was tall. He had the kind of face that made people adjust their posture when he entered a room, not because he demanded it but because something in the architecture of his features and the set of his shoulders communicated, without a word, that this was a person for whom the world arranged itself. He had silver eyes that his pack described as fierce and that Elara had thought, privately, in a quiet moment of absolute honesty she had never shared with anyone, were cold. She had kept that thought to herself. She had told herself she was wrong. She was looking at those eyes now across the length of the hall. He lifted one hand and the last of the murmuring went still, and the silence that followed was the kind that has weight. He spoke clearly. He always spoke clearly, in the slow and controlled voice of a man who had never once needed to raise it to be obeyed. His voice carried to every corner of the room without apparent effort, the way voices do when they have been used to carrying rooms for a very long time. He said that after careful deliberation he had reached a decision regarding his fated bond. He said that the bond, while genuine and real, was not a chain that bound him beyond reason. He said that a king had obligations that transcended sentiment, obligations to his bloodline, his pack, and the generations that would come after him. He said that the future of the Drake line required a mate who could carry those obligations forward. He did not look at her. Elara noticed that. She noticed the specific point on the back wall above the crowd where his gaze had fixed, and she understood that he had chosen that point deliberately, that looking at her was something he had decided in advance not to do, and that the decision to not look at her was its own kind of statement. He said the word. Barren. He said it the way someone reads a weather report. Flat. Factual. Something that is the case and cannot be argued with because it is simply the condition of the world. He said that Elara Voss, his fated mate, had been confirmed by the pack's healers as unable to bear children. He said this in front of 300 wolves who knew her name and her face and the 4 years she had spent waiting for this night. He said it in a room that had held every ceremony the Drake line had ever marked, births and deaths and joinings and the beginning of things. He said that he could not, in good conscience, bind the future of his people to a woman who could not give them heirs. He said that he had therefore chosen Lady Seraphine Cole, whose bloodline was proven and whose future was certain. He sat down. The room was very still for a moment. Then it moved, the way rooms move when they have absorbed something difficult, a small collective exhale, a shift of weight, eyes moving sideways to read the faces around them. Elara heard every word. Her fingers went numb fast, starting from the tips and moving inward, and she became acutely aware of the texture of the fabric at her collar, bunched there because her hands had closed around it without her permission. Her hands were doing what her mind refused to do, gripping the nearest thing and holding on. She did not cry. She was not capable of crying in that moment. There was too much happening in her body at once for any of it to resolve into tears. Her chest felt very tight. The room felt very bright. The torches that had seemed warm 20 minutes ago now seemed harsh. The faces of the people around her were turned toward her, some openly, some pretending not to look by looking at the middle distance just above her shoulder, and in their eyes she could read the full spectrum of what people feel when someone else is publicly shamed in front of them: pity, relief, curiosity, discomfort, and here and there something uglier that she refused to name. Lady Seraphine Cole stood at the front of the room in her deep blue dress and kept her eyes forward and her chin up and did not look at Elara. Whatever she felt about this moment, whatever her relationship was to what had just happened, she had decided that looking at Elara was not something she was willing to do. Elara fired that away without knowing why. 2 of Selim's guards appeared at her sides. They were not rough with her. That was almost the hardest part. They guided her toward the side door with the practiced gentleness of men following precise instructions. Be careful with her, she imagined the instruction, do not cause a scene. The gentleness communicated, more clearly than harshness would have, that this outcome had been planned in advance. That the side door had been identified. That her removal had been choreographed. She walked. She kept her chin parallel to the floor. She kept her hands loose. She walked through the side door and into the corridor beyond it, and the door swung shut behind her and the ceremony continued. She did not turn around to check. She did not need to. The corridor was stone and dimly lit and very quiet. She sat on a bench against the wall. She pressed her back against the cold stone and she looked at the opposite wall, which was featureless except for an iron torch bracket with a spent torch in it that no one had replaced. She counted her breaths. Each breath took about 3 seconds. She counted to approximately 80 before she stood up. She went to the small guest room she had been given. It was spare, a bed, a basin, a small window that looked out over the park courtyard. She changed out of the white dress. She folded it carefully, which was not something she had planned to do, which was not a logical response to anything that had just happened, but her hands needed to do something and they chose this. She put the dress in the bottom of her leather bag. She checked the bag. 3 changes of clothing. A small amount of money she had saved over the course of the previous year, kept in a cloth pouch in the inner pocket. A photograph, creased down the center, of herself and her mother taken years ago outside a house that had since been sold and then demolished to make way for something else. Her mother was gone. There was no family to call. There was no park to return to. The park she had belonged to was the one that had just walked her out a side door. She left the parklands before midnight. The road out was dark and straight. No lights beyond what the moon gave, which was not much because the sky was overcast and the moon came through in patches, there and then gone. The trees on both sides stood still. The air was cold. Her breath came out in small clouds that disappeared immediately. She walked. She had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when she stopped. She stopped for no reason she could articulate. Not because she heard something or saw something. Not because she was tired. She just stopped in the middle of the road and stood in the dark and let the quiet of the countryside settle around her. She placed one hand flat against her stomach. She did not know why she did that. It felt right in the way that very few things had felt right in the past several hours. Something in the gesture was instinctive, the way some gestures are before you understand what they mean. She stood there for a moment. Then she kept walking. She did not know yet what that instinct was reaching toward. She did not know that in 6 days she would stand in a rented bathroom in a city that did not know her name and look at a thin plastic strip and feel something pass through her that was too large and too contradictory to have a proper name. She did not know that the first thing she would feel would be something very close to a laugh and the second thing would be something very close to rage and that both of them would be the appropriate response. She only knew the road. And the cold. And her own breath. And the specific, aching silence that follows a thing that cannot be undone. She kept her hand on her stomach until the parklands were far enough behind her that she could no longer smell the torches. Then she let go. She picked up her pace. She did not look back once. 3 years is not a number until you start counting what it holds. Elara did not count the years as years. She counted them as mornings, as the number of times her alarm had gone off at 2:45 and she had risen in the dark and gone downstairs and started the ovens. She counted them as the progression of sizes in the boy's clothing, the transition from newborn to infant to toddler, each size donated to a shelter on the edge of Dunmore that she had found in her first month in the city and returned to like a ritual. She counted them as the particular weight of a sleeping child, which changes constantly and which she had carried in every possible configuration, one over a shoulder, one on each hip, 2 in each arm during the early months when they would not settle without contact. 3 years, in real units, was approximately 15,000 loaves of bread, give or take, plus an uncountable number of croissants and 412 birthday cakes, including the ones for the boys, which she made herself and which were always chocolate because they had decided as a collective household that chocolate was the only acceptable cake and she had not fought this. The bakery was called Voss. It had a blue door that she had painted herself the first spring she was there, on a Sunday morning while the boys were asleep and the street was quiet, a particular shade of blue that was not fashionable but that she liked because it reminded her of nothing in particular and she needed things around her that had no prior associations. She had opened Voss with the money she had left after renting the apartment above it, which had not been enough money, strictly speaking, for both the deposit and the initial equipment, but she had found a second-hand oven that needed minor repairs she taught herself to perform from an online tutorial watched on a borrowed phone, and she had opened on a Thursday with 12 items in the case and a handwritten sign in the window and 421 days of pregnancy and newborn. Logistics behind her, operating on a level of exhaustion she had not known the human body could sustain and remain functional. The bakery grew because the bread was good. She made good bread. She had learned from her mother, who had learned from her mother, and she had spent the years she was waiting for the ceremony learning to do it better, refining the recipe the way you refine something when you have time and need to put it somewhere. She had put it into bread. The bread remembered. The city of Dunmore was neutral territory. No park claimed it. This meant it was full of rogue wolves and humans living alongside each other in the pragmatic way that people share space when neither group has the option of excluding the other. It meant no one tracked rank or bloodline or the particular energy signature that marked an alpha heir, or if they did, they were polite enough not to say so. Elara had chosen it on those grounds alone. The boys had arrived in a rush and a miracle, all four within 40 minutes of each other on a night in late winter when the snow was coming down outside the clinic window and Nora, the rogue healer who had answered her posting with a flat fee and no questions, had set her jaw and done the work with the focused competence of someone who had seen complicated deliveries before and was not going to be rattled by this one. After, when everything was quiet and the four of them were bundled and sleeping in a row, Nora had stood at the window looking at the snow and said, "You understand what they are?" Elara had said yes. Nora had asked if there was anyone who would need to be notified. Elara had said no. Nora had looked at her for a moment the way people look when they are calculating the distance between what you have said and what you mean and finding that the gap is intentional. She did not push. She had said, I will come back for the 3-week check. After that you know where to find me. She had left. Elara had lain in the small bed in the clinic room and looked at the 4 of them and thought, well, here we are. Their names had come to her gradually over the days that followed, not in one sitting but in the way names sometimes arrive, one at a time, as if the child in question reveals it by some quality of face or sound or stillness that you could not have identified in advance. Colt arrived first, because the oldest boy had a gravity to him from the very beginning, a quality of watching and assessing and then deciding, and the name fit the way a well-made piece of clothing fits, without adjustment. Fawn came next, for the youngest, who was the loudest from his first breath and who approached the word as if it were an argument he intended to win. Gray for the third, who was quiet in a way that she understood, the quiet of a person paying close attention and not seeing the need to narrate their attention. Arlo for the fourth, who had eyes that made people pause even at 3 weeks old, eyes that seemed to be taking the measure of whatever they settled on. They were 3 years old now. They were also, clearly and unmistakably, alpha-born, all 4 of them. The energy that came off them in a room together was something that any wolf could feel from 20 feet away and that even some humans seemed to register without being able to name it, that faint unease that made people step aside on the sidewalk and then look back wondering why they had done that. Elara managed this with the same pragmatism she applied to everything. She chose their school carefully, a small building on a quiet street run by a woman who was not a wolf and who had the particular combination of patience and authority that small children required. She talked to the boys about what they were in language they could understand at their current ages, which meant she said, you are strong. You are kind. Being strong means you help people, not push them. They were too young for more than that and she did not give them more than that. The mornings were the hardest and the best simultaneously. At 2:45 she went downstairs and started the ovens and began the dough. She moved through the kitchen in the dark, by memory and by hand, navigating around the familiar shapes of equipment and shelving the way she navigated everything now, by the knowledge she had built herself, the kind that lives in the body rather than the mind, that does not require light. At 6 she went upstairs. She woke Colt first because he woke clean, a hand on his shoulder and eyes open, already somewhere between asleep and considering the day. Fawn required 3 attempts and a great deal of patience and the removal of the blanket from his head, which he replaced each time until she took it off the bed entirely. Gray woke between them on the spectrum, slowly, without complaint, blinking at the ceiling for a moment before accepting that morning was a condition he could not negotiate his way out of. Arlo was often already awake when she arrived, lying still and looking at something she could not see. Dot arrived at 1 and the boys ran to her with the universal enthusiasm of children for people who love them without obligation. Dot had been a schoolteacher for 30 years and had retired into a very specific kind of boredom that Elara's arrangement had solved neatly. She did not ask questions about the boy's father. She did not speculate. She brought biscuits from the shop 2 streets over and she played the particular card game she had invented for 4 players that had rules simple enough for 3-year-olds and enough moving parts to keep them occupied for an hour. She was one of the best things Elara had found in Domo. The second best thing was the apartment itself, with its 4 windows and the bookshelf that covered the entire north wall and the small table in the kitchen where the 5 of them ate every dinner together, crowded and noisy and real in the way that only things you have built with your hands are real. The night all 4 boys were sick at once was in February of their second year. Gray had started it on a Wednesday morning with a fever of 101 degrees that was manageable, she thought, until by Wednesday evening Colt had the same fever and Thursday morning brought Fawn and Arlo into the misery with the complete commitment of children who do not do anything by halves. She cancelled Thursday at the bakery and sent Dot a message. She bought medicines and cool cloths and crackers and cups designed for small sick people and she moved between the 2 bedrooms with the systematic focus of someone running a very small, very loud hospital. The boys were not graceful sick people. Fawn was loudly miserable in ways that communicated his suffering to the entire apartment and possibly to the floor below. Colt was quietly miserable in ways that were somehow harder to watch. Gray wanted to sleep and could not get comfortable and shifted in his bed at intervals that seemed designed to keep her in the doorway checking on him. Aloe burned hot and said very little and looked at her with silver eyes that were glassy with fever in a way that made her stomach clench. By 2 in the morning all four had eaten something and the fevers were slightly lower and she had cycled through every cool cloth twice and the apartment smelled of eucalyptus rub and apple juice and the particular staleness of sickness contained in a small space. She sat down in the hallway between the two rooms. She put her back against the wall and pulled her knees up and closed her eyes. She was tired in a way that went past the body. Not just muscle tired but core tired, the tiredness of a person who has been the only responsible adult in a situation for a long time without interruption. She knew what she would do if she reached the real edge of it. She had Dot, she had Nora's number, she had the school teacher who had offered twice to help in emergencies. She knew she was not alone. But in this moment, at 2 in the morning, she was alone. She sat with that. She did not think about Selim Drake. She had trained herself over 3 years not to do that, not because the thought of him was painful in the way that people mean when they say a thing is painful, not a fresh wound that required guarding. She did not think about him because he was not relevant. He was not present. He did not exist in the world she was building and she had decided, cleanly and entirely, not to let him exist in the one inside her head either. What she thought about, sitting in the hallway, was Thursday's deliveries and whether she should contact the supplier about the butter order and whether Coates' preschool picture was on Friday or the following Monday and what she was going to make for dinner when the boys were well enough to want food again. She thought about the bookshelf and whether she had space for any more and about a specific book she had been trying to find time to finish for 6 weeks. She thought about the way Fon looked when he laughed, which was with his whole face, every feature involved, nothing held back, the most unguarded expression she had ever seen on a person. She opened her eyes. Fon coughed from the bedroom. She got up. She went back in. She was in there until dawn, when one by one the fevers broke the way fevers do, not dramatically but in the slow cooling of a forehead under her hand, a temperature reading that was lower than the last one, a child who had been fretful going still and then sleeping properly, the even breathing of someone who has finally let the body do its work. By morning all four of them had eaten toast. By 10, Fon was attempting to take apart the television remote again, which she chose to interpret as a positive indicator of recovery. She stood in the kitchen doorway with a cup of coffee that she had reheated 3 times and watched him and thought, there it is. She finished the coffee. She went downstairs. She opened the bakery 4 hours late and apologized to no one because no one was waiting, and she made bread and she did not think about anything except the bread, which was how she preferred it. The cream envelope arrived on a Tuesday in the following autumn when the boys were 3 years and 4 months old. It came with the regular post, which already distinguished it from anything she would have expected, because official pack correspondence did not typically mix with ordinary mail. But there it was. Thick cream paper. Her name in careful formal script. And on the back, pressed in black wax, a seal she recognized before she turned it over. The Drake seal. The Royal Pack's mark. Her hands went very still. Not numb, the way they had gone numb 3 years ago. Still. There is a difference. 3 years ago her body had reacted to shock. Now it was reacting to recognition, which is a common thing. She set the envelope on the counter beside the flour bin. She served 4 customers. She explained the almond tarts. She made change. Then she opened the envelope. A summons to the Royal Blood Gathering, annual event, all packs attending, her name specifically listed, King Selim Drake's seal, no explanation for the specificity. She read it twice. She set it down and looked out the window where 2 pigeons were disputing ownership of a bread crust with the focused energy of creatures who believed the stakes were very high. She had known this was coming. Not the specific letter, not the specific event, but the shape of it. She had contacts in Domo, other rogue wolves, people who traveled between territories, a few who kept ears inside the royal pack the way some people keep a radio on, not always listening, but the sound there if you need it. The information had arrived in pieces over the previous months the way significant information tends to arrive, first as rumor, then as confirmation from a different source, then as the silence of a thing that has been confirmed and no longer needs discussion. Seraphine Cole had not conceived. 3 years of trying. The healer's report had gone to the Royal Council 6 months ago. The council had begun, quietly, to look. They were looking for a broken woman. Someone diminished and grateful to be remembered. Someone who would come quietly. Someone who could be managed. Elara stood in her bakery on a Tuesday afternoon with flour on her hands and a royal summons on the counter, and she thought about the woman they were expecting to find. Then she thought about what they were actually going to find. She went upstairs. She called Nora. She called the hotel in Adamore, the city where the blood gathering would be held, and booked rooms under her own name. No alias. No pretense. Under her name, the name that was on the summons. She looked at the boys' clothes and calculated what they needed and what she could afford, and she went to the shop on the high street that sold children's formal wear and spent money she had allocated for the bakery's new display shelf on 4 small dark suits with 4 small ties and 4 pairs of shoes that she already knew at least one of the boys would object to on principle. She did not tell them much. They were 3. What she told them was, "We are going on a trip to a very big building where there will be lots of people, and we need to be in our nice clothes, and we need to stay together." Colt had looked at her with that careful, measuring face he had inherited from somewhere she did not let herself examine, and asked if everything was okay. She looked back at him. She said yes. She meant it. She packed the leather bag. She chose not to take the photograph from under the bed. She did not need it for this trip. She was not going to Adamore to remember who she had been. She was going to be exactly who she was. On the evening before they left, she looked at the cream envelope sitting on the counter where she had left it for 3 days, and she thought, briefly, about burning it. The thought had a certain satisfaction to it. She sat with the satisfaction for a few seconds, and then she put the envelope in the outer pocket of the bag. She turned off the lights. She slept better than she had expected. The city of Adamore sat on a hillside above a river that turned copper-colored in autumn. The royal blood gathering was held in a stone building near the summit, large enough to seat 500, with flags that hung from iron poles outside and high windows that let the evening light fall in long diagonal columns across the floor inside. Elara arrived with 4 boys and 2 bags on a cool afternoon, checked into the rooms she had booked, and brought the boys down to the restaurant on the ground floor for dinner. They sat at a round table near the window. The restaurant was full of wolves from different packs, formal clothing, formal bearing, the watchful ease of people in public who are tracking the room by instinct. The tracking began almost immediately. Not dramatically. Not obviously. But she felt it, the shift in the quality of attention in the room, the way conversations adjusted at the edges, the waiter who paused a half-second too long when he looked at their table before recovering. The boys were sitting still, which was itself notable because the boys rarely sat still, but they seemed to understand in the intuitive way that small children sometimes understand when a situation requires stillness, and they were quiet and observant, and the energy that came off all 4 of them in a contained space was something that wolves who could feel it would not be able to ignore. She had known this would happen. She had brought them anyway. She ordered food for them and coffee for herself, and she answered the waiter's questions about the menu with pleasant brevity, and she did not acknowledge the watching. 2 men at a far table spoke quietly to each other, and then one of them rose and left the room. Elara registered this without reacting to it. She knew what it meant. Someone was going to the building up the hill to report that she had arrived and that she was not alone. Good. After dinner, she brought the boys upstairs and read to them, 1 on each side of her on the large bed and 2 at the foot of it, which was the arrangement that had evolved over time through a democratic process that no one had formally organized but that somehow always resolved to the same configuration. Colt on her right, always. Fawn on her left until he fell asleep, and then he migrated and you could not predict where he would end up. Gray at the foot in the center. Arlo at the corner, watching, until sleep pulled him down. She read until they were all asleep. Then she sat in the quiet for a while. She thought about the morning. She thought about the doors of the blood gathering hall opening. She thought about what the room would hold and who would be at the front of it and what it would feel like to walk toward that rather than away from it. She had thought, in the weeks after receiving the summons, about what she wanted to say. She had composed long internal speeches, sharp and precise, that named each thing he had done and placed the cost of it where it belonged. She had built arguments that were airtight and true and that could have held up in any hall of judgment. She had dismantled all of them. She did not need a speech. She had 4 boys who were going to walk through those doors behind her, and every wolf in that room was going to feel what they were, and that was going to say everything worth saying. She went to bed. In a different building on the same hill, Selim Drake did not sleep. His advisor Fletcher, a compact man with grey at his temples who had been with the Drake line since before Selim was born, had come to him at 9 in the evening and delivered the report in the measured voice of a man whose professional skill was delivering information without editorializing it. Elara Voss had arrived. She was not alone. 4 boys. Alpha-born. All of them. Approximately 3 years old. Fletcher had waited to see if there were any questions or instructions. Selim had said he needed a few minutes. Fletcher had left. Selim had sat in the chair by the window that looked out over Adamor's rooftops, and he had done the arithmetic that he had been, at some level, dreading for months. 3 years ago he had stood in the hall and used the word like a fact. He had used the report he had been given and he had made a decision, and he had not questioned either the report or the decision because he had been a man who did not question reports delivered to him by trusted sources, and he had been a man who, when he made a decision, did not revisit it. He was still that man. Except that man was sitting at a window at 9 in the evening the night before the blood gathering, looking out at nothing in particular and calculating that if the boys were approximately 3 years old and the ceremony had been 3 years ago, then the report, the one that had said Barren, the one that had given him permission to do what he did, had been wrong. He thought about who had commissioned the report. He thought about which council member had a connection to the Cole family. He thought about the specific conversation he was going to have with that council member after the gathering, which was not going to be a pleasant conversation. None of that helped him with the present problem, which was that in the morning there was going to be a hall full of wolves from every pack in the territory, and a woman in that hall who had every right to every word she chose to say, and 4 children who were his sons and who had been growing up in a city he had never visited for 3 years without him. He had done that. He had not known he was doing it. But that was the kind of reasoning that sounds like an explanation when you say it inside your own head and sounds like nothing at all when you say it out loud to someone who has been raising 4 alpha heirs alone for 3 years. He went over the words he had prepared for the formal greeting. They were correct and measured and said almost nothing. They would hold the shape of the moment without giving anyone anything to work with. He was still going over them at 3 in the morning when he finally stopped trying to sleep and simply sat in the chair and waited for dawn. Fletcher knocked at 7. Selim said he was ready. He was not ready. He was never going to be ready for what walked through those doors. The blood-gathering hall held 500 wolves from every pack in the territory. Long tables ran the length of the space. Candles burned in iron holders, hundreds of them, the kind of lighting that made everything look significant. At the front sat the royal table with Selim at the center, his council arranged around him, and the chair to his left that had been empty for 3 years, that everyone could see was empty, that every alpha family in the room understood the meaning of, now dressed with a formal arrangement of greenery as if the emptiness were something that could be decorated around. Selim greeted the arriving families. He shook hands and spoke and smiled at the right moments. He was accomplished at this. He had been the face of the Drake line since he was 16 years old, and he had learned to perform it without performance, to be present and warm and exactly what the room needed without anything it cost him becoming visible. He watched the main doors while watching everything else. The hall was nearly full when they opened. Elara Voss walked in wearing deep green. The color hit him fast, not white, not the ghost of the last image he had of her, but something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with ceremony or expectation or what she had once been waiting to become. She walked with the particular stillness of someone who has finished deciding something and arrived at the other side of it. Not performance. Not defiance. Just presence. She was here and she had decided to be here, and every line of her communicated that the decision had been made with full awareness of all available options, and this one had been chosen deliberately. Behind her came 4 boys. They came in a line. Dark suits. Shoes that actually looked worn in, not brand new, which meant she had thought ahead. The oldest walked slightly in front of the others in the way of someone who has appointed himself a particular responsibility and is taking it seriously. The second was looking around the room with the quick-eyed attention of someone cataloging. The third walked with the quiet evenness of someone entirely comfortable inside his own skin. The fourth walked last and looked up as he came through the door, and his eyes swept across the crowd with a precision that had no business existing in a face that young and found, before he had crossed the threshold, what he was looking for. He looked at Selim. He held it. Selim felt something happen in his chest that had no name. He could locate quickly enough to examine it. The hall went quiet in a wave. Table by table. Pack by pack. The Alpha families felt it first, 4 Alpha signatures in one room, children still, but unmistakably what they were, the air thickening with it the way air thickens before a storm. 300 wolves recalibrated simultaneously, and the silence that followed was not the polite silence of a former event. It was the silence of a room that has been knocked sideways by something it was not prepared for. Selim descended the steps. He crossed the floor. Protocol required a formal greeting. He had the words. He had rehearsed them. He said her name. He said he was glad she had come. He said there were matters of significance that required their attention. Then he said, "You should have told me. That was not on the list." It came out anyway. Elara looked at him. She did not look surprised. She did not look angry. She looked at him with the expression of someone who arrived knowing exactly what this moment would contain and is confirming, calmly, that the assessment was correct. She said, "You told me first." 4 words. The hall held them. Every wolf in that room had been present at the ceremony 3 years ago or had heard the full account of it carried from pack to pack by the reliable and merciless efficiency of oral history. They knew the word he had used. They knew the room it had been said in. They knew the dress that had been folded and taken away. They knew what the word had meant in the context of a hall like this one and a king like him and a woman standing at the edge of things that had been decided for her. The 4 words she had just said landed in all of that. Selim could not think of a single thing to say that would not make it worse. He was a man who was rarely without words, and this was a new experience, standing in the silence of his own accumulated choices and finding that the language had simply gone. At the royal table, Seraphine Cole sat very still for several seconds. Then she rose with the controlled dignity she had always maintained and walked toward the side door at the far end of the hall. No one stopped her. Several people watched. No one spoke. Colt, the oldest of the boys, moved forward 1 step and took Elara's hand. He did not look at Selim. He looked at his mother. His expression was the expression of a person who has made a decision about where to stand. Elara looked down at him. She did not smile. She did not need to. She looked back up at Selim. She said, "We will speak privately when you are ready. Not before." Then she walked to an open seat at one of the long tables, settled her boys around her, and asked the nearest server what was available to drink. The hall resumed its noise in a slow wave, like a held breath released. Conversations restarted. The sound built back to its previous level. Selim stood where she had left him for one more moment. Then he walked back to the royal table. He sat down. Fletcher leaned close and said something in his ear that Selim did not register because his attention was 20 feet away, where 4 boys were accepting cups of apple juice from a flustered server and where Elara Voss sat with her back straight and her hands folded and the expression of someone who has spent 3 years preparing for a room and finds, having arrived in it, that she is not surprised by a single thing it contains. He looked at the empty chair to his left. He looked at his hands. He had spent 3 years being the most powerful man in his territory. He had just lost something in front of every pack that mattered without a single word being raised in argument, without anything he could call a confrontation, and with an economy of language that would be repeated in every pack hall in the region by the following morning. He picked up his glass. He drank. He did not speak again until the formal proceedings required it of him. 4 days after the blood gathering, Elara was at the hotel suite's small kitchen counter slicing apples into quarters when the knock came. She had been expecting it. She had been expecting it specifically this morning. Fletcher's schedule was predictable and Selim, whatever else he was not the kind of man who let a necessary conversation sit longer than it had to. She set the knife down. She went to the door. Fletcher stood in the corridor with a folded letter and the expression of a professional who has delivered difficult correspondence for 30 years and has long since stopped having opinions about its content. He said that Kingsley Drake requested the honor of a private meeting, at her convenience, at a location of her choosing. She took the letter. She read it. It confirmed what he had said, in the language of formal requests from people who do not make formal requests as a rule. She said, "Tomorrow morning. Here. 10 o'clock. Come alone." Fletcher nodded and left, and she closed the door and went back to the apple slices, which were for the boys, who were in the adjoining room with Dot, who had driven up from Dunmore on 36 hours' notice with a bag of biscuits and no questions, which remained one of the finest qualities Elara had encountered in another person. Outside, the city of Adamore was in the grip of the kind of political motion that follows a significant public moment. She knew this not from official channels but from the sources she had developed over 3 years, the contacts who moved between territories, the Alpha families who had found reason to speak to her at dinner the previous 2 evenings with the careful indirection of people signaling interest without committing to a position. Fletcher had confirmed, in the way that formal communication sometimes confirms things by what it omits, that the council was meeting. 3 of the 7 council members had raised formal objections following the gathering. Not moral objections, she harbored no illusions about that. Legal and territorial ones. For undeclared Alpha heirs created complications of succession and alliance that the council was obligated to address regardless of how anyone felt about the circumstances that had produced them. The boys existed. They were real. They were Selim's blood. The territory had to decide what to do with that fact, and it could not do it without her cooperation. She thought about what he would offer. She thought about what she would accept. She thought about the bakery. The 6 tables. The blue door. The flower smell at 2:45 in the morning. She thought about the particular quality of the early hour in the kitchen, just her and the ovens and the door, the whole city dark and quiet outside the windows and the work inside them warm and demanding and completely her own. She thought about the white dress. She had kept it. She still had it. It was still at the bottom of the leather bag under the bed back in Dunmore. She had not taken it out in 3 years. She did not look at it. She kept it the way you keep a thing whose meaning has not finished revealing itself. She did not know yet what it meant that she had kept it. She put the apple slices on a plate and knocked on the adjoining door. Selim arrived at 10 exactly. He came alone. He wore nothing formal, no rank insignia, no symbols of the Drake line, no visible indication of who he was beyond the particular posture of someone who has spent their entire life being responsible for a room and carries it in their body even when they are trying not to. He looked tired. Not the cosmetic tiredness of a person who had one bad night but something deeper, the kind that has accumulated over time and has begun to settle into the set of the jaw and the eyes. She let him in. The boys were with Dot. The suite was quiet in the way hotel rooms are quiet, a particular contained silence that is different from the silence of a space that belongs to you. He sat in the chair she indicated. She sat across from him. The table between them was small. She did not offer him anything. He did not ask. He said, "I was given a false report." She said, "I know." He said, "The healer was paid by a council member who had financial ties to the Cole family's political network. The commission was arranged before the ceremony. I did not know this at the time." She said, "I believe you." He looked at her. He had not expected that. She said, "It changes the circumstances of how you came to say what you said. It does not change that you said it. In a room of 300 people. To my face. Without asking me first. Without a second opinion. Without waiting even one day to be certain." She said it calmly. She was not performing calm. She was simply calm. He said, "Yes. You are right." She sat with that for a moment. He told her what had happened in the year that followed, the second year, when the reports from the healers about Seraphine had begun to raise questions and he had started to understand the shape of the problem. He told her he had looked for her. He was honest that he had not looked in the first year. He said he would not pretend to a concern he had not immediately had. But in the second year he had looked and he had not been able to find her. She said, I arranged it that way. He said, yes. I understand that now. He folded his hands on the table. She noticed that his hands were slightly unsteady and she noticed herself noticing it and chose not to assign its meaning. He told her what he was offering. He said it plainly, without softening the edges to make it more palatable or sharpening them to make it more impressive. Full acknowledgement of the boys as his legitimate heirs, made public, formal, binding, and immediate. This was not something he was negotiating, he said, this was going to happen regardless of any other outcome. They were his sons and that was a fact that could not be managed or reduced. The question of the lunar position was separate. He was offering it. He understood it was not his to bestow, strictly speaking. He was offering it with the understanding that her acceptance of it was in no way required and that the absence of her acceptance would not affect the boy's status. If she chose to return, he said, he would rebuild things properly. Without conditions she had not agreed to. Without expectations she had not been consulted on. He said he understood if the answer was no. Then he said, I am sorry. He said it the way someone says something that is true and insufficient simultaneously, without trying to make it more than it was. Without the inflection that asks the apology to do the work of forgiveness, which is a separate transaction that takes much longer. She sat with it. She said, I have a bakery. He said, yes. In Dunmore. I know. She looked at him. She said, it is a good bakery. I built it. The recipe is my mother's. The ovens I repaired myself. The door I painted blue because I wanted a blue door and there was no one to tell me otherwise. It is mine. He said, yes. She said, I am not going to give you an answer today. He said, that is fair. She stood. He stood. He moved toward the door. He stopped in the frame of it. He said her name and she looked at him. He said, they look like you. All four of them. Around the eyes. She considered this for a moment. She said, they look like themselves. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once. He left. She stood in the center of the quiet room for a while. There was no drama left in the space. The conversation had been what it was and it had ended and the next thing had not yet begun and in the gap between them she was simply standing in a hotel room in Adamore on an autumn morning with the light coming in through the high windows. She went to the window. The city spread below her on the hillside, all close-packed rooftops and autumn trees and the river at the bottom catching the light. She stood there for a while and thought about none of it in particular and all of it at once. She thought about what it had cost to build the life she had built. Not as a measure of sacrifice, she did not frame it that way, but as a plain accounting. The sleepless years. The early mornings. The nights in the hallway between two bedrooms. The money that did not stretch far enough and the finding of creative solutions to that problem. The days when she was so tired she stood in the kitchen for a full minute before remembering why she had walked into it. The days, rarer but present, when one of the boys said something unexpected and funny and she laughed so hard she had to sit down. The day Cole stood in front of the bookshelf for 40 minutes choosing a book with the seriousness of a scholar selecting a primary source. The day Grace said, unprompted, that the sky over Dunmore was his favorite color and she had asked what color he thought it was and he had said, I think it is called before. That was the life she had built with her hands. The question of whether to trade it, expand it, or keep it exactly as it was belonged entirely to her. She went back to the bag. She took out the cream envelope from the outer pocket. She turned it in her hands. The thick paper. The black wax. She thought about the evening it had arrived, standing at the bakery counter, the specific way her hands had gone still rather than numb. She carried the envelope to the bedside table where a small candle sat in a glass holder. She used it in the morning sometimes, this candle, for the particular quality of quiet it produced in a room that was otherwise full of noise. She lit the candle. She held the corner of the envelope to the flame. It caught slowly. The black wax softened. The thick paper took longer than thin paper would have. She watched the fire work its way up from the corner, the cream color darkening, the drake seal disappearing last. She held it until she had to let go. She set the final piece in the glass dish and watched it finish. The room smelled briefly of smoke. She opened the window. The morning came in. The smoke went out. She picked up her phone. She called Dot. Dot said Fun had taken apart the hotel television remote completely and had sorted the pieces by size on the bedspread and was now apparently attempting to reassemble it in what he believed was a better configuration. Elara said, "Does he have all the pieces?" Dot said, "I think so. He is very focused." She said, "Let him try." She sat on the edge of the bed. She could hear them in the background, the particular sound of a room containing 4 people under 4 feet tall who are doing 4 different things simultaneously. For narrating his technical process. Gray saying something quiet that made Dot laugh. Allo, who she could not hear but whose presence she felt in the specific way she had learned to feel it, that watchful wait. She listened to them. She was still for a moment with nothing but that. She had thought, 3 years ago on a dark road with her hand on her stomach, that she was walking away from everything. She had not been wrong about the direction. But she had been incomplete in her understanding of what the walking was for. She had not been walking away from a life. She had been walking toward one. She had not known yet what it would look like. She had not known its dimensions or its texture or the specific shade of blue she would paint the door. She knew now. She had not come to Adamore to recover something she had lost. She had come to make a decision from a position of full knowledge, with her sons beside her and her name in her own voice and the plain fact of what she had built visible to anyone who cared to look. She had done that. What came next was not a return. It was not a reconciliation. It was not the resolution of something that had been interrupted and was now resuming. What came next was whatever she decided, and she would decide it on her own schedule, and it would be built on the same foundation as everything else she had built, her hands, her choice, her terms. She was not afraid of the decision. She was not afraid of anything. She had not been truly afraid since the night she stood in a bathroom in a city that did not know her name and understood that the verdict delivered in front of 300 wolves had been, simply and completely, wrong. Not wrong as a moral failure, though it was that too. Wrong as a fact. Wrong. She had known it then, and the knowing had changed the shape of everything that followed. It had been the foundation. The specific, undeniable, factual error at the center of what had been done to her had made all of it, all 3 years, all 15,000 loaves, all 4 crepes in a row, all 45 minutes of holding an envelope to a candle, something she had not survived despite the circumstances. Something she had built because of them. She said goodbye to Dot. She stood up. She went to the adjoining door and knocked. Fon answered before she finished knocking, which meant he had been on the other side of it, which tracked. He looked up at her with his father's silver eyes and the stubborn set of his jaw that came from somewhere she no longer needed to trace, and he held up the remote control, fully reassembled, and said, "I fixed it. It is better now. I moved some things." She looked at the remote. She said, "Does it work?" He pointed it at the television. The television turned on. She looked at him. He looked at her. She said, "Well done." She took his hand. He pulled her into the room where the other 3 were, and the door closed behind them, and outside the window Adamore went on being a city, and the river at the bottom of the hill went on being copper-colored in the autumn light, and upstairs in a building higher on the same hill a man sat at a window waiting for an answer that had not yet arrived. It would come when it came. On her terms. The only kind that counted.